For those of you who don't know me, I'm Marjorie Sussman, and I'm the Trust and Estates partner here at Malm. And I've been here about 10 years, and I've been in this area of practice for a number of years before that. I have observed throughout my practice that there is a gap between our legal documents and what actually happens on the ground. So no matter how thoughtfully we make our plans and how carefully I draft the documents, a lot of times there's the result after the fact, after one of my clients passes away, is not at all what they intended. So we conceived this series of programs to talk about how to bridge that gap in different areas. And a month ago, we had a presentation by Diane Savastano from Health Assist about bridging the gap between people's healthcare documents and the end-of-life care that they actually get. And this morning, we're going to focus on bridging the gap between people's legal documents and the transition of assets, such as family businesses or vacation properties. I wanted to read you a little blurb that came across my desk last month. It's called Inside the Rollins Family Feud. The Rollins family is known for two things: killing vermin and throwing parties. Unfortunately for the Rollins family, the party is over. Orkin and the 9 related extermination companies housed under Rollins Inc. remains the leading company in pest control. When Glenn sued his father Gary, CEO of Rollins Inc., as well as his uncle Randall, company chairman, one of the nastiest intergenerational battles took place. Glenn's 3 siblings joined in the lawsuit, claiming they were being denied their rightful cash allocations. While Randall's 5 children stuck by him and Gary, Ruthie took her children's side when she filed for divorce from Gary after 45 years. In this money fight, fathers, sons, wives, and cousins were pitted against each other. It was a Greek tragedy. The feud, which has played out over the past 4 years, may finally reach a finale, the trial and the court case deciding whether the older generation is withholding handouts is projected to begin next year. Yet it is clear that a verdict is already in. This is a quote. A lifetime's work and a family legacy was destroyed by shoddy estate planning and questionable parenting. There's plenty of assets. It has to do with extreme destructive efforts by my father and uncle to control. No one disputes those assets are ours. The spokesman for Gary and Randall contend the plaintiffs' lawsuits are motivated by greed and self-interest. They have no regard for the structure of the Rollins family assets. If I had been asked, I might have been able to help out with the shoddy estate planning documents. I don't think that any of us could have helped out with the questionable parenting. But our speakers, Doug Baumoel and Blair Trippe, if they had been involved, I'm quite confident that this family would not have ended up in court. Doug and Blair are the principals of Continuity Family Business Consulting, and their bios are in your materials. I'm not going to read those, and I'm going to turn it over to them.
Great. Thank you. Thanks, everybody, for coming. So getting folks on the same page, whether they're your clients or your own families, and getting them to make effective decisions in a timely manner is a tall order. And the subheading is what enterprising families and their advisors need to know. There's a lot they need to know. And for us in an hour and change to really go through all of that is just not feasible. So what we've decided to do is sort of present a smorgasbord of frameworks that we use to help families get on the same page, make good decisions together. And it's going to cover a wide variety of things, including some talk about some introduction of family governance, a lot of conflict management, and other things. We do not believe in sort of best practices as a recipe for what you should all be doing with your families. You each work with families. I'm sure at this table there are folks that work with $500 million families and folks that work with $5 million families or less. So any best practice is certainly not going to be applicable and implementable for that sort of wide range of client families. So with that, I think let's get a feel for the room.
Yeah, so how many of you all have family businesses or are involved with family businesses? A couple, okay. And how about foundations? Anybody have a vacation home that's shared or might be shared in the future? Couple, okay. So there's a range of people. So a lot of what we do is we work with families who own and operate businesses together. We work with families that share wealth together. Anytime that you're going to have families that have that overlap of owning, managing, using, there are pitfalls. So a lot of what we're going to try to do is take you through that. Now, I'm sure any of you all have studied family business or been to presentations on family business? Some of you. Okay, so you know a bit about it, and you've probably heard the parable of shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in 3 generations. The concept being the first generation creates all this wealth, the next generation, uses it, maybe grows it a little, not too much, spends some of it, and by the 3rd generation, they lose it all. We don't really agree that that's the way things need to be. And so a lot of what we do is try to educate people about what's going on, how do you manage what you have, how do you learn to work together, and so that's what we're going to talk to you about. The concept of the overarching theme of this talk is really about creating a vision. And we talk a lot about vision as how does this family choose to work together, and how do they recognize that they're really all in the same boat and they need to be rowing in the same direction. If people are going in different directions, it's very difficult to get to any particular destination. So a lot of what we try to help families do is figure out what is their vision, what is it that they're trying to achieve as a group, what's important to them. And to that degree, some families do it more, some families do it less. So just in terms of, to talk a little bit about, just to make sure we're all sort of on the same page when we talk about vision, a lot of the visioning is thought about as corporate visioning versus family visioning, but they are very much related. And so that's something that we'd like to have you take away. As Doug said, we're putting together frameworks for you, things for you to think about when you work with your client families or when you work with your own families. A vision is really, what you want to be. We want to be a family that stays together and gets along and shares holidays, etc. That's sort of your vision for what you want to do. Obviously, every family will be different. Your mission is really what you do. What do you do to achieve that? We believe in staying home on weekends with the family, or we believe in, as a group, we care about being stewards in our communities, and so that's what we do. We do those things. The purpose is why. Why do you do these things? And your values will guide that. So when you think about these families in different ways, you want to think about what do they want to be? How do they want to get there? And how can you help them? Strategy is really how do you achieve that vision? So in a corporation, you're going to look at strategy in terms of marketing and who your clients are, et cetera. And for families, for enterprising families, there are other things that strategically they do to keep their family together. And sometimes it's considering what wealth they've created, how to keep that wealth. They set up family councils, which is a form of family governance. I always step back and say governance is just a big word for how do you make decisions together. And family councils are just sort of an organized group for how people are able to express what they're interested in and work together to achieve those things. There also are family banks, and we're going to talk a little bit about family banks and foundations that can help families implement some of what it is that as a group they'd like to do. So, a lot of families do share assets, a lot of families do share businesses, and so we look at an enterprising family as any family that is doing something in addition to just being family.
So typical challenges, and this is what we're going to be focusing on. This is really what guided what we thought was going to be important to present, the different frameworks. So obviously communicating about wealth. We all know that. Diane touched on that at the last presentation, and I'm sure that's going to be a theme running through all of these presentations. It's the last thing folks really want to talk about, and that's compounded when there are difficult intergenerational relationships and when families are more complicated, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. As Blair just mentioned, we can't stress enough how important having crafting an aligned vision together as a group, how important that is.
And we frame this sort of in a pretty negative way, and we don't mean to insinuate that all families have insufficient communication or a lack of structure and planning. These are just really the things that we're putting out there that it's often what we see, which is why we see these families, but things for you all to think about and take away with you of the things that you should start to think about with your family.
Now, one of the defining characteristics of our company is our focus on conflict. And we look at conflict when folks share assets or share management of a company. We view managing conflict as the core challenge. And when folks call us to get involved in a case, they're in pain, they're in conflict of some sort, or they're stuck, not able to make decisions together because of fear of conflict. So conflict is a core thing that we focus on. We'll be talking about it a bit here, and we can talk about it during the Q&A if you want to dig deeper into that. But when we look at conflict, we look at three underlying reasons. Folks have opposing goals, they have incompatible values, and families who share assets together or work together in a firm, they bring a lot of baggage with them. And we'll talk a lot more about that. There's also a lack of knowledge and skills as families evolve to greater and greater levels of wealth. And there's the term here, immigrants to wealth, which is a term that one of our colleagues in this field, Jim Grubman, has sort of promoted and has written a book about in several articles. And it's an interesting thought. Imagine a family coming from abroad and moving to the United States. There's a certain degree of assimilation that needs to happen. There's new skills, new knowledge that needs to be acquired for the following generations to really be successful. And if you apply that framework to wealth, as families in Generation 1, and this is Jim's slide he let me borrow for today. In Generation 1, it's really all about the individual, and it's all about perseverance and hard work and being all you can be and being self-sufficient. Those are great skills. Those are great middle-class values. But in the next generation has a requirement to learn how to share wealth. And in the third generation, it gets even more complicated. In the third generation, if truly generational wealth is developed, there have to be structures put in place, and next gens or third gens need to understand better how to work with advisors and how to work within those structures to perpetuate and build on the wealth that has been created before them. So the need for planning, Diane, of course, mentioned that the last time. So it's not enough just to do your tax planning, of course. So family planning in terms of all the things Diane mentioned last month. Who is the healthcare proxy? Do you have all of those family issues sorted out? Decision making and career paths in the company if there's a family firm as one of the core holdings of the family. What is the type of business, the entity structure? And is that the type of entity structure that can be transitioned easily? So this is a list of the various lenses you should look at the planning problem through. And one of the things that greatly complicates the conversation is that we're living much longer lives now. And we have much more complicated families. So this is the new normal. And I don't know if all of you recognize the picture on the right. It's the modern family, of course. And that is much closer to the new normal family than Leave It to Beaver, obviously. That's a family that has a patriarch married to a non-citizen, adds a lot of complications in estate planning, non-citizen who's younger than his own kids. So if you think of second to die insurance, that's not going to do his own kids a lot of good. That's a blended family. They have together their own child. There's a same-sex couple in the family with adopted children. I think children in the last episodes. Sorry? Yeah, in the last season. There's a traditional family with all of those issues that a traditional family has. But what's missing? In that picture, the mom is missing. And the mom flits in and out of some of the episodes. But you know, when she gets older, she's going to come to one of their doorsteps asking for help. And that's not considered. This is a family that does not show any significant level of conflict between the siblings or between generations. It's a very happy family that gets into all kinds of mischief. But they don't have disabilities in their family. They don't have illness in their family. So it's an idealized situation. We speak to it because it's a complicated family, but it's not nearly as complicated as real life. So one of the frameworks that we thought would be helpful is a traditional framework that, and by the way, in Modern Family, of course, there's a family business at the core of the wealth. And although all families all branches in this family seem to be fairly self-sufficient, there is a lot of talk about, well, Dad still is really the benefactor of this family. And what's going to happen? There's a few episodes where they even talk about that. Not a lot. But so to help you better understand how to look at a family business, I'm going to turn it over to Blair and introduce something called the three-circle model.
So for those of you all who have had any family business education at all, this is something that you've seen before. For those of you who haven't, it's a very simplified model of what is a family business and how do you parse out who's who and what they do. So you look at the business as one group, you see the family as another group, and you see the ownership as a third group. In a family business, these overlap. And the conflict that starts out really generally happens in those overlaps. Sometimes people who are working in the business are arguing about the business, but oftentimes it's when they're wearing different hats, when their roles overlap. And so am I mom at the office, and then I'm your boss at the office and I'm your mom at the dinner table. How does that work out? What is that? What are my motivations? What are my concerns? So what we try to do is we try to help people look at their families and their family businesses. And if it's a family of wealth and maybe the business is managing that wealth, sometimes it's a foundation, the business is managing that foundation, and the ownership is you're not owning the foundation, but you're governing the foundation. So there are different ways to look at your particular situation, and we encourage you to do this and to think about who is where and what people care about. Generally, and this is a generalization, the folks who are working in the business are caring about salaries. They're caring about reinvestment in the business for growth. They're looking at perks for themselves and for their employees to keep them so that the turnover isn't becoming a problem. The owners who aren't in the business, they want the business to do well because they really want the dividends. They really want the cash flow from the business because they want to pay their tuition bills or their medical bills or get a new car or a house. So if you have siblings or cousins where they're equal owners and yet one's in the business, that's an example of one of those overlaps where there's going to be trouble down the road, or there could be. And a lot of what we do is we try to unravel that and help that from happening. Now, this model is a good way to look at it. We think it's a little simplified, and so we would encourage you to think about a family business or a family of wealth in a more complicated setup, where in addition to those three circles, which you can see still embedded there, you have the governance structure, which is basically the board of directors that's working with the business. You have a family council, that's the little circle within the family structure, which is the family governance. How do you help the family make decisions together and create that aligned vision to make sure that everybody is looking for the same thing? We have the advisory system in there. It's the one space that doesn't actually have any overlaps because we prefer to see businesses where there are no overlaps in the role of the advisor. The brother is not the CPA. The dad is not the corporate attorney. Those kinds of conflicts, or that the board does not have the company advisors on it. We also look at what is the atmosphere or the environment around that business. Who are the regulators? What are the customers look like? The distributors? All of those different constituencies that have to be taken care of. If it's a vacation home that you're looking at, and again, if anybody wants a copy of this, we can send it to you and you can draw in where everybody sits. But if it's a vacation home, you're looking at the renters or the realtors or the zoning boards, or what are the things that you can do. And so you can jot down everybody's name and where they sit, what system they're in or what systems they're in. And we put little arrows, which helps us think about where these people might want to move to. Somebody wants to get on the board, or somebody wants to get involved with the foundation, or where we think they should go. Maybe we think somebody in the business should be moved out of the business. Maybe we think that somebody on the board should step off. They can still be owners. Or maybe we think that estate planning is ready to take effect and some of the ownership should be transitioned. So some of the folks that are just in the family space should move into the ownership space. And it's really a good way to understand who sits where and what their issues and concerns might be. And again, it doesn't always play out exactly the same way. There's some owners that don't care about the dividends because that's just not important to them. But as a general rule, owners are looking for return. So that's something that we work with.
And just want to add one piece to that. In our work with families, we go through this with the stakeholders, and we ask them about all the advisors that they're working with. And all too often, families are very loyal to their early advisors, to their early employees, and more often than not, they outgrow their early advisors. And having a model like this, having a framework like this to initiate that discussion with stakeholders is very useful. Ask them about, what is the complete universe of advisors that you're relying on, and are those advisors appropriate? It's, as a consultant to family businesses, the role of a trusted advisor that's already in place can't be minimized. So what we typically try to do is augment the advisory group rather than replace advisors. Okay. All right. So we thought we would talk a little bit about the psychology of an enterprising family. Because it's really so core to the types of issues that folks get involved in. And I want to hark back to something, one of the slides that Blair spoke to, and that was, what is an enterprising family? And if you think about the evolution of mankind, most families were enterprising families. They lived in the longhouse, and their economic futures and presents were completely enmeshed and tied. And in those families, there was, they needed and they had very significant coming-of-age ceremonies and processes to enable kids that within that structure, within that very enmeshed structure and very interconnected structure, to really self-differentiate. So we'll get to that right now. So Bowen family systems theory is a psychological framework that most family business consultants and folks in this field ascribe to. And what it does is it looks at families as an organization. It's not focused on the individual psychology of any of the family members, except in that the psychological issues are a result of the family structure. So one of the things that comes out of that is birth order, right? So how is the psychology of a child developed by being, or impacted by being the youngest of three siblings, let's say, or the eldest, or the middle? So Bowen family systems theory, and related theorists talk about that this theory is certainly not predictive, but it does explain a heck of a lot. When we're working with families and we see certain behaviors, it really helps them and the folks that they work with to help them realize that their behaviors, while in a certain circumstance may be problematic, might be able to find some explanation in the structure of their family. So by helping them get some more insight into how they behave and how that relates to the structure of their family, they can then choose different behaviors. They can kind of better understand what's driving their behavior and then modify it or have more success in modifying it. So birth order is not predictive, but it can explain a lot.
The bossy older sister.
Yeah, exactly. Another very important aspect of Bowen family systems theory is this idea of differentiation, which I mentioned just briefly with the family in the Longhouse and the coming of age ceremonies. So in a enterprising family, well, in a non-enterprising family, kids grow up, they go off to school, and they figure out what they want to do for a life. They meet someone, they get married, they start a life. With enterprising families that have significant wealth or business opportunity, something like that, there's this sort of gravitational pull that keeps next gens connected to the family. And it makes it harder for them to truly strike out on their own, be their own person. That has very significant impacts in families, in the sense that they're more enmeshed families, and conflict and stress that appears in one branch with a parent or so just spreads like wildfire. Everybody is connected with everybody in these enmeshed families with less differentiated individuals in them. Now, we work with families that have significant wealth, that have significant businesses where the kids are working in the business, and they're not enmeshed families. They're not under-differentiated individuals. They're the exception. This is sort of a risk that families in this situation face. And unlike those families in the Longhouse, we've sort of lost a lot of our coming-of-age ceremonies and traditions that serve to help support differentiation when you have these family businesses or family wealth at the core of a family. Narcissism. So everybody thinks narcissism, oh, that's really bad. Well, if I'm putting my money into a company, there better be a healthy dose of narcissism in the leader of that company. They have to feel very confident that they can do whatever they're doing better than their competitor, better than anybody else. So we call that productive narcissism, and there's a great book by Michael Maccabee from Harvard called The Productive Narcissist, and it's a great term. The problem with that is that it's hard to shut off, and too often productive narcissism that works really well in a business setting leaks into the family setting and is destructive. So that's another risk that enterprising families face. And substance abuse. Families that, where else can you come to work inebriated or not show up or and not get fired or not, or for families of wealth where the economics aren't really driving your need to work, for example. So substance abuse, it's the perfect storm for substance abuse in an enterprising family. And it's something we see quite often. So this is a genogram, and it's kind of the core tool in Bowen family systems theory. And we do this with all our families, and we encourage you to do this with the families you work with or with your own families. The tool we use is GenoPro, and it's a Microsoft-based tool, but there are also genogramming programs for Mac as well. And we believe that if you're working with families, or if you're trying to get on the same page with your own family, it's good to have one piece of paper where you can see where all those relationships are.
The other thing that it does is it helps you understand who's related to whom. And this is obviously not in your nuclear family, because you probably have that down, but for a much larger generational progression in a business where you might be in the third, fourth generation, and you look at the different branches and you look at the ownership within those branches, who's holding what. You look at the number of kids per branch, because that's obviously going to have an effect on the distributions that they get. You know, if you're working with a company where 25% of the proceeds go to each branch, and one branch has 3 kids and the next branch has 7 kids, those cousins are going to have a wealth disparity that, at least coming from the business, that's something to be looking at. It also helps us, and if you're working with families that are large, it helps you figure out who's related to whom, because we meet lots and lots of stakeholders, and so we fill that out, because 3 months, 6 months, 9 months down the road, when something comes up with some individual, it's very helpful to be able to look back and say, okay, that's so-and-so's sister, or that's the uncle of whomever. So it's a way that I think it's helpful to keep track.
Yeah, and this genogramming also enables you to put emotional relationships as an overlay on this map. So if there's a war going on between a person over here and a person over here, you can draw lines on top to indicate that. So you can get on one sheet of paper not only the structure of the family, but some information about how they relate to each other.
So when we look at the ways that families evolve over time, we always tell people that what's interesting for us in our work is that we work across all different industries, we work across all different sizes of businesses. But what's interesting to us is where they are in the generational progression. And it's very different working with somebody who's in a first generation versus somebody who's in a third generation. And so we look at how families evolve and what their needs are as they go forward, in the generations. So if you look at the folks in Gen 1 who have created the wealth or created the business, what they needed going forward was a way to work together. How do you interact? How do you manage conflict? And it's just the two of them. And there are, disputes that have to be, worked on, but it's fairly simple. When you get to the second generation, you've got siblings. The siblings are living in the same house, so they're hearing generally the same thing from the parents and living within the same culture. But they have an age disparity, and so somebody who's 10 years older than somebody else in the family has maybe a different view. Perhaps wealth was created at different times during their lives, and so that one might grow up significantly more affluent than the other. But in general, siblings share the same values, the same culture, and they understand. But then they are starting to have to work together with each other as well as with the parents, so it gets more complicated. Then you have their conflicts and divorces that happen in those marriages. And you get to the third generation, and it's even more complicated, because now you have cousins. You have cousins who are growing up in different households, and they have different values and different expectations. And they're now dealing with aunts and uncles as well as grandparents and their siblings and their marriages and then their children, and it gets farther and farther apart. And so it moves from simple conflict management, and just how do you negotiate various issues, to more of a branch politics, because the branches then become more solidified. So you might have a large family where a lot of the cousins don't really know each other, and they're very tied to their branch, but not necessarily to the whole family. They live in different places. These days, people move. They don't all stay in the same town, so they're going to different places, and they have different ideas. We see this a lot if you have a house that you're sharing, or that somebody is willing the beautiful house, on the beach. One of the books is The Big House that we have on the reading list. It's just sort of what happens over time. And when the parents have it, it's great, and the kids love it, and everybody comes, and it's wonderful. And then the siblings share it, and some live in California, and some live in Florida, and it gets more and more complicated, and push that down to the cousins' generation. So we look at the kinds of things that happen and how they evolve.
And so I guess the core takeaway from this slide is in the early generations, the most important thing for families, for the success of enterprising families, is to manage conflict, interpersonal conflict. When you get to the later generations, it's to set up governance structures.
So if you want to look at what conflict is like in family businesses, and we think about it an awful lot, most people, when they think about how do you resolve conflict, they think about force. They think about going to court. They think, I'm going to sue you and force you to do things my way. Other people think about bargaining. They think, well, we'll get a mediator. We'll do it in a nicer way, and we'll figure out how to mediate this and resolve it going forward. We don't think of it that way as much because, and you saw the diagrams in the 3 circles in the larger model, you're dealing with systemic conflict. So it's not an isolated dispute that you need to resolve. It's really more of a systemic conflict that needs to be managed over time. It's not going to go away because the system continues and different people shift in different ways. And so it's a very different kind of need for conflict management than you have in a civil dispute. The other piece is that in a family, so much of the conflict is caused by identity-based issues. Kids grow up in the family business or in the families of wealth, and Doug talked about kids being undifferentiated, so they're not able to strike it out on their own as easily, and they come back to the family business, and it's very much a part of who they are. And as soon as there's any sort of debate about whether they can work there or if the company is going to succeed or be sold or all sorts of these things, it's a very much of an identity-based conflict that is just not going to be susceptible to a lawsuit or mediation. So you can't really negotiate with somebody over identity-based issues. And so that's one of the hallmarks of the family business conflict, that it's systemic, it doesn't just get resolved, and it's identity-based. When we go into a family, we think that they are generally in some sort of conflict, which doesn't mean that they're actively fighting with each other. It doesn't mean that they're screaming and yelling and there's a food fight going on, but rather that they're stuck, that they're trying to get from where they are to where they want to go, and something is keeping them there, and that's what we call conflict. So much of what we're trying to do is to really unpack what is going on, how do we get them unstuck, how do we help them move forward. And because there's so many people, there's so many different generations, there are different wealth needs, there are different interests, there's different education levels. We worked with a family where one branch were all in the farming and the packing and the machining, and the other branch was running the business because they had all gone to business school. You've got a really big cultural difference within the same family. And yes, they all had their name on the door, but it gets very complicated. And the hallmark, I think, of family business conflict or enterprising family conflict is that the continuing relationships do matter. It's not as if I can just quit my job, slam the door, and leave and never see these people again because Thanksgiving's around the corner. So I'm going to have to deal with this. Or maybe we also share a house, or maybe we, are living on this same property in different houses. So the continuing relationships are important, and in our company, we feel that we need to do what we can to preserve those relationships. So again, it's managing what is going on now, but also what's coming down the pike, because there is something coming down the pike. It really doesn't end. A lot of what we do is try to figure out how do we manage this conflict, because as I said, we don't believe it's a good idea to go to court and just sue people, because using power generally creates more conflict, and it generally doesn't end well. We always say when families go to court, everyone loses. So that's usually not, so I have to say there is a place for litigation, but generally we don't like to do it. We like to develop the organization and the families out of conflict. So we take a developmental approach, which means we try to put in the structures that are going to help this family manage that conflict over time. So in an organization, we look at, do they even have an organizational chart that has an articulated career path for next generation members coming in? Do they have policies about what does it take for a family member to get into this business? Do they have to pass a test, or do they just need the right last name? Do they need a certain education level? What does it take? What happens when you don't have any of that? And if you have an enormous company, it's a lot easier than with a smaller company. But if my brother is 10 years older than I am, and his kids are, 10 or 15 years older than my kids, his kids might be able to just get there, take all the jobs, and then my kids don't even have a shot because the company's not big enough for that. So what is the policy that gets put into place? Because I'll tell you, that's going to affect my relationship with my brother when my children can't get a job there and his kids are sitting pretty. So it's nice to have this family business, but these are the kinds of things that we see and that we think about and that we try to help families put in procedures and policies so that that's managed over time. The more objective policies can be, the clearer the job descriptions are. A reliance on market-based salaries. I mean, that's another thing. I mean, you have a sibling who's got $1 million salary, and then the others aren't getting dividends. You can have a problem if that happens, because some of that money, if the market-based salary would be $150,000 or $200,000, well, the other owners should be getting some of that. So. And it doesn't matter if there's enough money to go around. We always say fair is a 4-letter word, but it's very important. So we look at things like that. Governance factors in very much to this. What sort of oversight is there over the executives? What sort of communication is there from the shareholders? What rights do they have? How can they have a voice there? In addition to developing the organization and the policies and procedures, we look at the individuals. What do they need in terms of education or coaching, perhaps, to help them do their jobs better or to help them relate better? In a family system, sometimes you're not looking at improving your skills at some sort of job, but you're trying to figure out, how do I work better with my family? Sisters who really just don't get along, how can you help them better understand what's going on and work better together? Again, it harkens back to the whole shared vision. What is it that you all are trying to achieve? If you're trying to go in the same direction, we can help you. And if you're not, we can then try to help you figure out what direction you want to go in. But people who are working at odds are not ultimately going to get along very well. So we think a lot about that. Family governance, we mentioned that a little bit in the bigger model that had the family council in there. That's a way for families to have a voice. In the second generation, you generally don't need a family council because they're the siblings, there just aren't that many of them. But when you get into the third and fourth generation, what is it that you want for this family? What is it that it takes to be a member of this family? For some companies, a share of the stock is the membership card. Sometimes there isn't a business. Sometimes there is a business and some don't have that share of stock. What is it that you're looking for, and how do you put in structure so that the family has, for example, the annual retreat, and maybe there's the family bank that pays for everybody, so if there is wealth disparity, nobody feels that they can't really get to the dude ranch. What are the kinds of things that you put into place, and how do you help them come up with an identity, come up with a vision, come up with a sense of where it is they want to go, what they want to do, and the mission of, how are they going to do it? What is it that they're doing? So the family factor, and if you want to talk about the family factor?
Yeah, the family factor is probably the most important characteristic we try to tease out of the family when we first start meeting with them. And basically it's an identification of, is the family bond strong enough to leverage compromise and a commitment to change? And if we question that, then we ask, can we strengthen the family factor? So the components that go into building the family factor are shared history. So I'll give you an example. So we have 2 families that we've worked with over the past couple of years. They both take vacations together as the whole family every year, sometimes more than one. One family was proud to say we vacation, all of us, we go down to Florida. And we have a very strong family. We have very strong shared history together, going to Florida, etc. The other family goes on fishing trips to Alaska together and other,
ice climbing.
Ice climbing, they do crazy things. But when we dug deeper, the family that goes to Florida together all the time had a lot of conflict. And it was conflict that was very difficult to manage. When we dug deeper, what happens when they go to Florida? They check in and they go their separate ways. They each have, all the kids have their own friends that they've been hanging out with since they were kids. And they compare notes on the flight back. How was your vacation? So despite the fact that they were very proud about telling us how close a family they are, they vacation together all the time, when you peel back the onion a bit, they really don't have as deep a shared history together as some of the other families that really engage with each other.
Or as they think they have.
Right. That really engage with each other when they do take those family vacations. So shared history, the way we look at it is do they have something to lose if they let conflict get the best of them? Do they have something to lose? Then we look at the shared vision for the future. Do they want to be connected? What happens when the patriarch or matriarch passes away? Are they invested in continuing those relationships further? Do they have something to gain? That's the question we ask. And sort of the bridge between the past and the future is this trust piece. And we don't look at trust the same way other folks probably do. We don't look at it as, I trust my brother because I know he has my best interests at heart. That's not our metric. Our metric is more predictability. I trust my brother because I know him. I know what he's going to do. I can predict that behavior. If I can predict that behavior, whether I believe his behavior is going to be in my interest or not, I can make plans. I can make decisions together with that person.
So what do you do in that family? So the Florida family, do you start counseling the matriarch and the patriarch to divide the assets and just separate the family because you know they're not going to get along and continue the business together? Or do you work with the second generation and say, you're each going to inherit separate pieces of the business because obviously it'll never work?
Good questions. The reason to split up family assets is rarely because of of conflict that can't be managed. That's really the tragedy. If families split up their assets or split up their company or sell their company because of their inability to manage conflict, that's a tragedy, and that shouldn't happen. There is a good reason to split up assets, and that reason is because people have different visions of what they want. That's it. But that's not conflict. You're allowed to have different visions and not be in conflict. Conflict is different. So what we try to do with families like that is we try to build that family factor. We did a retreat at the ropes courses. We build trust. We talk about the shared vision as a family. So what does family mean to one of the siblings? It may mean just getting together for Thanksgiving dinner every year until mom dies, and then then you're on your own. It's important for us and his siblings to know that, and then because that's a starting point to build something stronger.
So there's no exact answer because every family is going to be different, and you can't make a decision based on how they vacation. But what that does is that gives us a piece of the puzzle. Because when we work with the family, we're looking at, what are their goals? And are their goals shared? Do they have the same vision? Do they want the same things? We look at their values. Do they like each other? Do they share the same sort of risk tolerance? Do they like each other? And we look at the baggage that they're bringing to the table. Is this something that you can let go of? Maybe you need some therapy to help you move on. Maybe you just need to get it out there so that in talking about it or naming it, that removes the block and they can move forward. So we're looking at all of those things in addition to that family factor. If the family factor is high, that means the family bond is strong. There's more for us to work with because they do have something to lose. They do have something to gain because they care deeply about their family. If they care about that, we use that to leverage them working together and sitting down to help try to craft that shared vision. If that family factor is 0 because they're never going to see each other after mom dies, we don't have as much to work with. So at that point, family ceases to be family of sorts, and so Is this a family business because you share ownership? Well, if that's all that's keeping you together, if you're just tied together by money, and you want different things, that's when you're going to say we should split this up. So that vacationing piece isn't really going to tell us what the family should do, but it helps. It's just another piece in the equation of what's going on.
Yeah.
Totally agree, but I do think there's some examples where the generation that built the wealth is very unrealistic about the next generation carrying that wealth or getting along. I mean, I do think there's a very practical aspect of it. If they can't vacation together, if there's no relationship, like, I don't care how many team building exercises you do, it's just not going to come together. And I would think that that would be very, very difficult.
Well, it's not easy, but the tragedy and the failure is when families fail to transition to next generation leadership because of lack of planning or unmanaged conflict.
But so then when does that start? Like, do you start that I would imagine you'd have to start that in the next generation very young.
Well, the younger the better, but no, we come into families that are in active litigation, and we back them out of active litigation. So the family that I mentioned that vacations together but apart ended up with a period of litigation, and then came back from it, and now they're working together very well.
You know, we talk a lot about like the elephants in the room, right? So I think that helping the family to get to what is really blocking. So this particular, realizing that every family is different. This particular family who vacations in Florida, did you ever discover why are they all going their separate ways? Is there a big elephant? Does Dad drink too much and by the end of the day start picking on everybody and they just can't wait to get away from us? Is there something they're not, that they've just decided to run from rather than actually talk about?
There were so many things going on in that family. I'll give you a couple of insights. One was Dad was very competitive. It was a hockey playing family. And Dad pitted the kids against each other, made them compete against each other. And, they had to overcome that. So the realization that that's their history, that's where they came from. This is a family that did participate. We recommended that they get individual therapists, which they did, and that was a big reason why they were able to back out of litigation. They started to understand their family of origin better, their sibling relationships better, and how the structure of their family impacted their personal choices, their personal psychology.
And when we look for therapists, because we do not do therapy, that's not in our wheelhouse. We look for therapists to refer in who understand Bowen family systems, because we really look at the family as an organization. We look at the family as a system, and just looking at the individual, while important, it's really, from our standpoint, important within the context of their family. So that's another piece of what we do.
Yeah, and so conflict management is, we think, so core to any of the work that's done in this field. These systems, when families share wealth together or share vacation homes or work in a business together, the systems are inherently conflictual. They're structurally conflictual. You can't escape it. And addressing family planning in all these aspects from the perspective of managing conflict, we find is incredibly useful. And that's why we've really built out these conflict management tools so extensively.
Which doesn't mean that you don't look at the business, because oftentimes when we're working with an operating company, the family system is incredibly important, but you can't just make the family get along and leave the business, because if the business doesn't stay sustainable, all bets are off. So we need to make sure that what is the environment the business is working in, what are the strengths and weaknesses of that business, and the threats to the business, and the competition, and the product lines, and does it need to expand. So we're not looking specifically at the family as an exclusive, but we're looking at the family as a part of this system, and we also look at the business system, we look at the ownership system, we look at the governance system. So they're all interrelated, and you can't really extricate one from the other.
One of the things that really ties that together is when Blair mentioned that if you think about how to manage conflict, most people think of, well, I could force the other to my will through litigation or threats of retaliation or force in some manner. Or you can manage conflict through negotiation and bargaining, right? Well, because these are identity-based conflicts, you can't negotiate who you are, really. And because force ends up triggering more conflict, so that's kind of a dead end. What Blair's referring to is this third type of conflict management that we call development. So our feeling and our approach to working with families in all these planning areas is through development as an approach to managing conflict, where conflict is really defined as whatever is preventing the family from getting to where they want to be. So this development is both personal and structural. So if we could help family members, stakeholders, be more empathetic to their other shareholders, other stakeholders, if we could help coach them so that they're better at their jobs or better in their roles, if we could help them have a better understanding of who they are and how they fit into their family system, if we could also look at the structure of the business, if we could look at maybe the need to build formal governance structures like a board of directors or a family council. That's structural development. So all our work, we call it conflict management, but it's very expansive, and it's really about developing individuals and the systems they participate in to grow them out of what we call conflict, which is whatever is stopping them from growing and getting further.
What do you see on average for how long a family business survives through the generations? I mean, you started your conversation with the first generation builds the wealth, the second one may...
Yeah.
Well, that's the parable that people use to scare families into hiring them, and we don't believe that that's really the case. We think that there's every size, shape, and form of outcome, and it just depends. A lot of it will depend on the economy. Did you build something that's actually, I mean, if you built the Betamax, you're probably not doing so well, no matter how great your family is. But on the other hand, if you came up with some great integrated circuit, you're probably you've got more going for you. So some of it is industry specific and has nothing to do with the generation. Some businesses really shouldn't transition. Just because, I started a dry cleaning shop doesn't mean that my children should take that over. I mean, maybe it's just sort of a one generation business, or maybe my kids do work there, but it doesn't mean that theirs should as well. So we don't believe that that's the progression that will happen, or that necessarily does happen, or even that it should. I think depending on what it is, businesses will evolve. If a family has a vision that they want it to grow and they want this to continue on for the generations, we want to help them do that. If they don't have the vision that they want it to continue, and they just sort of assume that it will, and we'll all get along and we'll all figure out how to make this happen, then it's likely that they're not going to do the planning, they're not going to put the structures into place, and by the third generation it will fall apart. Because it's hard enough for the parents, or the say it's the mother who started the company, or more likely it's the father these days who had started the company, to pass it on to the siblings, because he can say, you're going to do sales, you're going to do operations, and you're going to do the finance. And the kids say, okay, and that's what they do. And they don't have job descriptions because they trust each other. They can predict that they're going to do it. They end up saying, well, I trust him to stay in his silo and do the work. But then those siblings have kids. The kids grow up in different households. Some want to be there, some don't. How do they come into the business when you have these silos? Is it just, well, I'm going to be the operations I'm going to go into operations and I'm going to run the plant. Does that mean I have to work? Then that's because my father works there, so I have to work for my father. But maybe I like finance, or maybe actually it doesn't make sense the way this is structured because the company has grown, and so production is really permeating into all areas of sales and marketing and et cetera. So if you haven't put in that organizational chart, if you haven't put in job descriptions, if you haven't come up with market-based salaries or an ownership structure that's going to keep me in East Oshkosh instead of going down to the big city when all my other business school friends are going there, what are the things that you need to plan? And the family has to proactively decide to do it. It doesn't just happen. So, if you make those plans, then there's a path for the third generation to come in. If you don't make those plans, they come in and there's generally conflict because, my uncle's kind of in charge, but my father doesn't really respect him anyway. So, so there is no third generation that's going to die. I don't believe that. That's not what we see.
Yeah. So actually, Marjorie started off the introduction reading that passage, and more often than that's a very common situation with clients, and with we read about it in the papers all the time. Family business conflict can be extremely extreme and very difficult to manage. And one of the things we were trying to do today in this presentation is give you some insight into that. It's extreme and difficult to manage because it's identity-based conflict. Traditional approaches such as lawsuits or bargaining just simply don't work very well. And the best solution is to develop all parties, the individuals and the structures, as Blair was just talking about, to move these families forward. So in short, there are really no best practices that fit all families in how to plan for succession or managing conflict or anything. What we hope we've given you today is a series of frameworks to think about and to discuss with the families that you work with or with your own families. I'll be happy to take questions or take phone calls afterwards. Do we leave anything out?
Probably.
Yeah.
Questions, thoughts?
So from my perspective, because I'm working on a business succession plan for someone, how do I get that patriarch usually to do the work ahead of time so that it's set up to maximize the chance of success?
I think you ask questions. When the patriarch says, "I love my kids and I want to give them each 25% of the business," you might ask who's working there of their children. If none of them are, then that's great. If one or two of them are, then ask what he thinks the impact would be on this one working for the siblings, because essentially that's what's happening. And are there other assets? Can you strip out the real estate and gift the real estate and have the business pay? I mean, what are some of the other things? I think asking questions about the implications of what they're doing gets them to think about, I wonder if there's a different way. I wonder if there's another way to look at this.
I'm more of a tool-based. That's how I communicate through a lot of these tools. And I would suggest taking out the stakeholder map and really mapping out a playbook for succession. Putting in those little areas, the names or the initials or the job descriptions, whatever works for that particular client, and then drawing the arrows to where the patriarch or matriarch is suggesting that they want to be, and then asking the question, well, for them to move from being in the family to being in the business, it's visual, you can see it, that's where the arrow points. What skill sets do they need? What ownership makes sense? It sort of guides you in those questions to ask. That's why we present a lot of tools. And looking at the genogram also gives you a lot of insight to ask the right questions.
I'm sort of intrigued by the concept of an enmeshment, because in my experience with family-owned businesses and members who marry in or whatever, it seems like the enmeshment is what leads to incredible dysfunction, and then also potential addictions and on and on. And so I'm
Vicious
just,
cycle.
yeah, I'm just curious about sort of how that plays out. And is it only individual therapy where you really do the family of origin work so that you understand where you live in that structure, and potentially bring in spouses to do the same thing because they're so effective?
We actually just not walked away from a client, but put a client on hold saying you need to do some family therapy work first. Mm-hmm. They were far too enmeshed. We couldn't be of any help to them at all until they first unwound some of that enmeshment and some of the issues of lack of differentiation with the son that was in the business.
And how do you work with the families? Are you doing more like mediation where you're talking to one side of the family and then the other side? Or are you putting them all in the same room?
All over the map, but the way we structure our engagements, a family calls us. Sometimes they call us because they're curious, they want to check up, etc. But by and large, most of the folks that call us are in some kind of pain, in some kind of what we call conflict or being stuck. And the way we engage, first of all, is it's very specific. So when folks call in, Blair or I or Rick or any of the other consultants, we don't take the call. Actually, Ron is our practice manager. He takes the call so that stakeholders are not. There's no presumption that they have a relationship with any of the consultants that may eventually come in. So it's very kind of hands-off to get started. When we get the conversation to a point where they're interested in a chemistry meeting, we arrange a chemistry meeting. If it makes sense to go forward, we schedule an assessment period. That could be maybe 3 months. And we charge on a monthly basis so that it encourages clients to use us a lot. If they use us a lot, it's a better deal. If they don't engage with us, they're wasting their money. So we charge a monthly fee, we do an assessment, we give a plan.
And just to clarify, because I think you're asking about that assessment piece and what that looks like. And we talk to everybody individually. We talk to all the stakeholders individually. We talk to the spouses, which plays into the monthly fee piece, because when you say my husband doesn't know anything about this business, because usually it's someone from the business who calls us, we will explain that your husband is a stakeholder in the family business system and needs a voice at the table. So, and you already own us for the month, right? So it doesn't cost you anything for me to talk to your husband, but if we don't talk to him, he can derail whatever plan comes forth. So on a confidential basis, we do talk to each family. Someone was actually I was having dinner with a lawyer last night who was saying, well, so how confidential is it really? And I said, well, it's confidential in that we will not discuss with other people what is said. If you go to court and I'm deposed, it's really not. But that has not happened to us where we've been in that situation. We did have one situation where we did set up a mediation where we had an agreement to participate, and so we had that confidentiality for that piece, because that was the only way we could get them to talk about a particular issue.
So then after you do your interviews of all the family members, do you...
And maybe non-family executives who were, key employees.
Right.
And a thorough review of every agreement,
all the documents.
all the documents we can lay our hands on. So we do a thorough analysis of everything we can find.
And then you come up with your recommendations. Do you report back to the 2, 3, 4 people that hired you, or do you get the whole family back in the room?
They decide.
They decide.
Usually it's a key stakeholder group. Sometimes we'll have, we did one recently where we had sort of a 3-part meeting where we had the whole shareholder group, and then we had the board, and then we had just the key sort of executive.
Well, the executive session of the board. Yeah.
So, it will depend, and we don't try to be the experts in the business or the experts in their family. We take the cues from them. We just want them to feel heard and able to move forward. And so based on what we've heard in terms of what their vision is, or the fact that maybe one of our recommendations is that you need to craft this aligned vision, we put together different options for how do you get from here to there, and then an implementation for what it's going to take. Because sometimes they don't have the stomach for what it's going to take to actually get from here to there. So maybe they're going to choose something else. And then as far as that goes, then after that piece, they decide, they're going to hire us for this piece, or they're going to hire somebody else for that piece, or they're going to do these themselves. The sadness for us is sometimes they then just don't take the next step and engage going forward. And the result of a lot of our work is people start talking about a lot of things, and then when they don't move forward and keep going, often they will fester, and then we're called back in 6 months saying, you know, we have a mess. And we think, well, if you had just kept going, we would have, you know, kept it all going. But you know, every situation is different. Some assessments are 2 months, some assessments are 6 months. It depends where they are. We're all over the country, so if you're a lot farther away, it's a little bit more complicated. If you have 28 stakeholders, it's different than if you had 5.
Yep. And one of the things Blair mentioned, that we don't profess to be the experts in every industry or the experts in any given family. What we look at our charge is to know enough about the client's industry, to know enough about business in general, and to know enough about families in order to identify gaps in skill sets, gaps in planning, gaps all around. We have a bibliography of suggested reading in the pamphlet, right? It's there. Great. And so thank you. Thank you for your attention. Thank you for coming.